Putting together a presentation is more than a series of slides. It's
How are you taking them on a journey? People love to be on journeys.
If you don't love yourself and love your story, you will never be able to tell it effectively.
Hey there, everyone. This is Mike Texera, the host of the No Fear Presenting podcast. In their bio, my next guest wrote that her goal is dedicated to creating spaces where people from diverse backgrounds and experiences can come together in ways that foster meaningful connections. I can't think of a better way to spend your days. Angel Simone is a speaker, trainer, and coach. She really has a passion for empowering others to discover their unique potential. She is also a certified DE&I consultant. She's a keynote speaker and podcast guest, as you can see from her attending today. Recently, Angel captivated audiences as a TEDx speaker. If you haven't seen it, I want you to Google it right after this episode. It's really moving. Angel also has some background in corporate training, where she works for nonprofit and for-profit sectors. And if that wasn't enough, she does some volunteer work. She's on the advisory board of Elephant in the Room for the New Hampshire Theater Project, and also does work for the Trevor Project. A very, very busy person. You told me you actually did a 24-hour stint this week. So you are very busy. Thank you for taking the time, and welcome, Angel.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's absolutely wonderful to be here.
Yeah. I mean, putting this podcast together, I was looking for people who do things that people find fearful in presenting. And I found that TEDx, I mean, I had known you personally, but when I saw your TEDx, I was like, wow, Angel was really vulnerable, really talking about something personal. And I just, I wanted you to come in here and talk to the audience about that, because I think that's one of the biggest fears is trying to be personal, trying to be, vulnerable. It's like the F word in corporate communications. Don't be too personal,
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we go there, let's start with a little background. You grew up in Liverpool, England. Tell me about growing up there.
Well, I was born in Liverpool, England, but I didn't actually grow up there.
Oh.
I left there when I was around 2.
Okay.
I went to the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, with my mom, where I stayed for a while. Came back to England around 9 and went back and forth between the Caribbean and England. Ended up going to university in London.
Yeah.
So my childhood has a lot of travel in it.
Right.
I definitely feel very advantaged for having experienced both living in a third world country and in a first world country, and being able to feel at least that I can relate to all people and all cultures. And one of my favorite places to be is places that are multicultural, etc.
Yeah. And so did you prefer one place over the other, Caribbean or England?
For different reasons, both. I love heat. The Caribbean runs at about 95 Fahrenheit continuously with low humidity.
Yeah, that sounds like my jam.
Seriously, the reality is there's a decent amount of poverty. So if you could take some of the wealth of England and marry it with the heat of the Caribbean, you'd have the perfect place. Because England, on the flip side, seems to rain about 300 days a year.
Right.
So has a tendency to be really gray. But I love living in both places.
Yeah. So what was growing up like? Was it a happy experience? A challenge?
Well, my parents were divorced, so I lived with my mom alone, and she was a nurse and worked constantly, so was home alone. And as in the Black culture, I'm Black, and in the Black culture, discipline is a really large part of the way we raise our children. And so there was a lot of that spare the rod and spoil the child in my childhood. So discipline was a strong thing, and so was education. So I spent a lot of time just going to school, coming home, very few friends, very much alone. I'm an only child for my mom as well. So being able to find ways of entertaining myself was a huge deal. So one of the things I taught myself was gymnastics. And there's this story where We're in Tobago, which is one of the smaller of the islands, and I decided I wanted to practice gymnastics, and I did a flip, and my feet went through the glass. And I think my mom was more concerned about the glass than with me. I could hear the footsteps coming, and I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. So yeah, I found ways of entertaining myself, even if nobody else appreciated the way I did it.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it. But I'm sorry. Parts of that sound a little lonely. What do you think?
Yeah,
What do
it
you,
was. I once asked my mom if I was adopted because there was just no way that you would treat your own child like this.
oh,
And that's how it felt, at
right.
least.
Yeah.
But, having now as an adult looking back, as a single parent, trying to provide for your child, provide for yourself, bring in enough money, I can't imagine the amount of stress that she would have been under. So
Yeah.
I've done a lot of internal work in walking through some of that and releasing all the stuff that happens around that. And I'm a huge believer in things happen for a reason. And I will definitely say that
Yeah.
I would not be the strong, resilient person I am if it wasn't for some of the things that happened in my childhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny what you're saying about retrospect, because that really resonates for me. When you're a kid, it's all black and white. Why would you possibly do this? You're a horrible person. And I did the same. I looked back at my childhood, and my dad, oh my God, I think he was a wonderful guy, but I realized PTSD, probably ADHD his whole life, and
Yeah.
get diagnosed. He was awesome in a stressful environment, but not so good at the quiet moments. And it was a tough upbringing in 70s, 80s. Yeah, don't spare the rod,
Yeah.
especially in a immigrant childhood.
Yeah.
So yeah, you
Exactly.
learned to really double think before you acted and did anything.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
But so much of your life now, Angel, is about communicating, is about telling stories. Where were the seeds of that? Where do you think the seeds of the storyteller came from? Was there anybody in your family who was a storyteller or anything like that?
Not at all. What's interesting is because of the type of childhood I had, I would say actually that my inner voice must would have been squashed somewhat.
Yeah.
We weren't as children allowed to have opinions. You weren't. There was no way you were going to talk back to your mom or say that you disagreed with something. I listen to my children today, and I'm like, if I even came close to some of those sentences, I would have gotten a backhand so fast you wouldn't even see it coming, right? And so I think in my childhood, my inner voice was definitely squashed. And that's a large part of my story is I became such an introvert and stayed to myself, didn't believe in myself, didn't believe in my power, didn't believe I had anything to say, really learned to bury my emotions. Even crying wasn't allowed in my house. And the storytelling, I would say, if I had to really come up with a thing, would be I told myself stories. I used my imagination to dissociate from the trauma, right? And so I would be in a little world all by myself, and I would tell myself stories of what was happening. I would pretend I was on TV and that somebody was looking at me, and so I'd have to perform really well. And just all these really fantastical stories that I think is what helped get me through some of my childhood, but also allowed my imagination to really develop into a space where stories became comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think even though they weren't truth, they were a space that I could find comfort and
Yeah.
protection.
Yeah. A place of relief, a place of
Mhm.
release.
Yeah,
So much of
yeah,
what stories do for us is take away the scariness and put it into a narrative structure that we can understand, the good versus
yeah.
evil, the magic versus the everyday. Okay, so from that apartment, it seems, being in a box, and you speak a lot in your TEDx about that kind of constrained first part of your life. Can you talk to me a little bit about the transition from those days to your early adulthood? I believe you did engineering, you got married, all that stuff. How did you transition from that to that early part of your adulthood?
Sure. So yeah, one of the things that happened when I was in elementary school is my mom gave me a computer, and that allowed me to continue to dissociate in some ways. I think computing was something I could control. I realized how much I disliked people, and I found
And
that
computers made sense, right?
yeah,
They were logical.
exactly. It was logical.
No
You
surprises.
programmed what you put in, you got out. There was no disagreement, there was no trauma, there was no pain. And so I fell
Yeah.
in love with computing at a really young age. And so did computing as part of school, and I love math. I just mathematics is like my favorite subject. So I really excelled in those subjects. And I actually, my mom being a medical instructor, she trained nurses. I actually wanted to be a doctor for a long
Oh,
time.
wow, really?
Yeah. And when I was in high
And
school,
she did instructing, which there's a little seed
right? Yeah, sure.
the kind of
Might
things
be
you did.
something
Yeah.
there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
She was a teacher in the medical
Yeah.
field. So I wanted to be a doctor for the longest while, and her advice was there too much studying for the money you get. Like you'd have to wait way too long to earn money. And so she actually discouraged me from being a doctor. And so I
Wow.
just chose the thing that I was good at, which was math and computing. And so I moved back to England at the end of high school. And in England, the education path is a little different. We have to take what's called A levels or advanced levels. So you have to do a year or two just before you go to college, specifically in the subjects that you want to study in college. So I did math, physics, chemistry, and biology because I was like, well, maybe I still want to become a doctor. But I ended up getting accepted by the University of London Imperial College for Science, Technology, and Medicine. And the
Nice.
degree,
Wow.
the degree I ended up getting into was software engineering and artificial intelligence and robotics. So again, just getting into that place. So robots started to fascinate me, right? So you think about
Oh, yeah.
anything that's not to do with people, anything that was in this very sterile world. And it was 4 years. I got my master's and was in engineering. I got a full scholarship. So the organization, the company that gave me the scholarship, CGI now, I went to work for them immediately, and they
Mm,
had a project in New York that they were like, would you like to go to New York? It's a 3-year project where you'll just be managing junior programmers to do whatever in the finance industry. And at the
yeah.
time, it was an application that supported all the foreign transactions in and out of America. So of course, who in London doesn't want to go to New York to live?
Yeah.
And about 2 weeks before I'm moving, they say, oh, by the way, we're not going to send you to a New York office. We're going to send you to a Massachusetts office. And my response was, where the hell is Massachusetts? I had never heard of the state in my life. And they said the capital is Boston. And I'm like, I know Boston. Like, everybody's heard of Boston.
Right, right.
Nobody's heard of Massachusetts.
That's in the history books. Yeah. They should have just told you the temperature in Boston during the winter. Then you would have just run for the hills. Yeah.
For real. So I ended up moving to Lexington, Massachusetts, which is where the office was, and lived in Mass, did engineering, moved up in that organization through project management, product management. I mean, just really excelled in the organization. And I was there for about 13 years until 2008, 2009, when we had the dot-com crash.
Right,
And so
right.
it was all around finance and IT. And so I
Huh.
got laid off,
Yeah.
lost my job, and could not find another job in engineering IT for anything. And at that time,
Yeah.
I was attending a church, and they said, why don't you come work for us part time? We'll pay you while you look for a job, just so you can have some income to help with, being laid off, etc. And so I ended
Yeah.
up working for a church as like an event administrator. And that's when things started to really change. Um,
Now, were you religious growing up?
my mom was. My mom
Yeah.
my mom was Catholic. And so I grew up in that religion and
Mhm.
um, always hearing that being gay was a sin, and then joined a
Yeah.
church where that narrative was also enforced, and ended up staying at that church, working full time, becoming a pastor. But that's where things began to change for me because managing volunteers and really being forced to get to know people, I was accused
Yeah.
of being unfriendly and all sorts of things. And as a pastor, that you just can't be that. And so I had to learn how to speak to people. I had to learn how to manage volunteers, how to motivate them, how to learn. I had to learn how to recognize that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so
Oh,
realizing
wow.
that
Okay.
relationship was actually way more effective than me threatening to fire you if you don't do your job. And
Yeah.
in that space of training volunteers and therefore as a pastor preaching, I realized I really began to develop a passion for speaking. And if so,
Mm.
it was at church, ironically, that I developed
Yeah.
a passion for public speaking, passion for training, a passion for moving people forward, whatever that
Yeah.
meant,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
that's
I'm not so surprised. I mean, church is a great public speaking school. I mean, where else do you see people with passion,
that.
laying it on the table, talking magical thinking, and have a background music track
Right?
to like
Yeah,
builds you up. Yeah, I mean, it's really an inspiring
it
public
is.
speaking form. Now, here's what I find fascinating, Angel. It seems like, and tell me if I'm wrong, there was an uncomfortableness with sticking out. Would you say that was true? And so it seemed like you kept yourself really busy in the beginning there to kind of avoid that. And I think that's so common for so many people is like, let me excel in this. Please don't ask me to stand out. Let me just focus on my discipline.
Yeah.
Is that resonating with you? Is that
Yeah. So
maybe in
what's
retrospect?
there's a
It sounded like you had a triple major in there, by the way. So I just want to point that out. I mean, you weren't leaving yourself a lot of me time.
No. And there's a dichotomy there, right? So, not wanting to be in the limelight, hated attention, didn't want anybody to notice me, but put me on a stage and I
Yeah.
loved speaking. And for a
Oh
long while,
wow.
I didn't know how to reconcile those two things. It's like, I
Right.
don't see me for me, see me for the
Yeah.
speaker. Because
Right.
it was almost like I could become somebody else. And people I find as a public speaker, they make up narratives about you that may or may not be true, but I
Yeah.
prefer their narratives and maybe my truth, right? And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I've always sat with, as an introvert, how I could not like being in the limelight, not liking attention, but love, and still love public speaking and
Yeah.
moving people to action.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so fascinating. I'm kind of picturing the evolution of man chart. You know how there's different stages, and I'm thinking of like the evolution of Angel as a speaker. I think it's so similar to a lot of people. You go through this phase of like, please, I don't want to stand out. You're like in middle school, you're uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if you have something as challenging as your gender identity. I mean, even just being a normal
Yeah.
kid is tough in that phase, right? So you got that first phase of don't look at me, I'm keeping myself busy, don't look at me. But then there's the second phase that you're talking about right now, which is wait a minute, I like being in front of the crowd, but I'm not going to give them who I really am. I'm going to put on this coat of professionalism or religion or being a pastor and doing it, but not 100%. And then you had another turn to the next step of the evolution, right? What prompted that? What
So
brought you?
we talk about being in a box, and I know you've heard my story on TEDx. When I made the decision, so I'm a pastor, I speak a lot of Sundays, I'm counseling a number of people, and
Yeah,
I am inwardly wrestling with my sexuality and believing that I'm not good enough for God and all of those spaces. And I made the decision to come out at my church and lost my job, community, was asked to leave the church, etc. And
Man.
at that point, I was dealing with a ton of shame and guilt around who I was, didn't like myself, believed that God didn't love me, etc. And I spent about 3 years by myself on Great Bay, had an apartment. That's where you and I met.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, we both had those apartments there on Great
yeah.
Bay. Yeah.
And I did a tremendous amount of internal work reconciling who I am and who I want to
Right.
be and who this thing called God is. And
Mm.
out on the other side of those 3 years, I walked out realizing one, feeling way happier, way freer, stepped out of the box, got all the rejection that you were going to get. I mean, losing job, family, church, community, and all of that. It was as bad as it was going to be. So on the other
Yeah, I mean,
side
it
of it,
can't get worse,
right?
right?
Yeah. And this is I
Yeah.
think it's the deepest fear of most people when it
Right.
comes to coming out. Whatever the coming out is, not just in gender and sexuality, but any of our deep truths. The reason why we
Yeah.
keep it to ourselves is because we are afraid of being rejected. And so I'd done all this work around realizing that who I am, if I own all of who I am, I felt so much happier and so much freer and so much larger. And even God
Yeah.
became larger, beyond the Christian church. And so that's when the idea of authenticity became really a personal reality and truth,
Mm.
that being inauthentic kept me small, kept me hidden, kept me afraid, and stepping into my authentic truth, regardless of what anybody else thought of it. And that's why I say authenticity comes with a cost, because a lot of times your authenticity really challenges others to step into theirs, and they don't like it. And so they come back at you. And
Right.
that's where the shift happened. And I so that was in 2019. So 3 years. All of this started in
Yeah.
2016. In 2019, I decided to move to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and was like, I'm going to start life again. I'm restarting life, and I happened to be at a Creative Mornings talk, which is a monthly series in the
Yep.
morning, 8 a.m. in the morning. And I got on stage. They have what's called a 30-second pitch, where you can just say
Yep.
something for 30 seconds. And I got on stage in 2019 and I said, I am coming back, and I'm coming out, and I'm coming out proud, and I'm going to do something about it. And that's all I said. It was a commitment I made publicly to myself.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That must have taken so much courage.
yeah, it was. I was shaking. Thank God it was only
I
30
bet.
seconds. Um, Yeah, and the next time, May 2020, just before COVID hit, just as COVID was hitting, I did my first talk for Creative Mornings, and it was my story. And it was a
Yeah.
personal challenge to myself to not be silenced anymore.
Yeah.
I was like, this has cost me so much already. Let's make it worth it.
Yeah.
And that's how
Yeah.
that I know I got a long way. It took a long way to get there, but that's how I got there.
Yeah, but you got there, and that's a successful life. You win. You went through tough things, but you evolved to your full potential and your full self. That's an amazing story. Now, when you were thinking of standing up at that first creative mornings and talking about your truth, was there a sense that you were doing it for you, or was there any part of you that was also saying this might help someone? So I want to do this not just for me,
Yeah.
but for others.
The primary motivation was that I was doing it for myself, recognizing it would help others, but I was primarily doing it for myself. I needed to,
Totally fair.
right?
Totally fair. You
Um,
need, you needed that
I
jump.
needed
Yeah.
it. And what was interesting is having left the church in 2016 and having to get a secular job, etc., and realizing that being gay in the world, quote unquote, in general, wasn't generating any kind of rejection. Actually, most people really didn't care.
Yeah.
about my orientation. And I started to realize that there was this world that was actually very accepting and so very different from the church that I had attended. And in
Right.
doing that, it was almost a challenge to say, let's see how accepting the world really is. Let's tell this story and see what
Yeah.
happens. And the response was so positive, and I got a lot of positive feedback. And that in turn helped me continue to grow as a person and love myself. And I will say this, Mike, if you don't love yourself and love your story, you will never be able to tell it effectively. Um, we have got
So well said.
to
So well said.
we have got to wrestle that shame and guilt we have about ourselves and about our stories. And I think one thing we have got to accept is that very thing that we think is unacceptable, that very thing that we think is going to cause rejection, is the very thing that you need to share, because it gives permission for others who are struggling with exactly the same thing to say, wow, I'm not alone. I can be successful. I can survive, I can thrive. And so I always encourage people, the very thing you want to hide is the very thing you should actually learn to be comfortable with and declare
Right.
it, to take other people with you when you do it.
I love what you're saying, Angel, because I think there is this cult of wellness that always talk about like have the universe in mind, have others in mind for, and I think that what I like about what you're saying is you being selfish sometimes can impact others. I mean, you can't work or help others until you better yourself.
Exactly.
And I also think a lot about coming up in the business world where there were some angry dudes who were like red faced, reaming people out in meetings. And I'm like, now I look back at it and I go, what was that person hiding onto? What
Exactly.
demons were in that person's soul? And if we don't get out there and say, you
Mhm.
need to be comfortable with yourself before you start leading people and before you start training others.
Right.
Um, I don't think we can get better as a society, but I think we are. I think we're all starting to wake up
Yeah.
to that truth that
Yeah.
we need to. Business personal is a very fine line, and it's ethereal between those two worlds. The one informs the other.
Totally. Yeah, and
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
seen a lot of people try to mentor or coach other people. I've worked with and sex trafficking survivors. And you see a lot in those kind of movements where people want to help and support survivors, and they themselves haven't done the internal work. And sometimes we can cause
Mm,
harm when we don't do the internal work and we decide to lead others. And we don't necessarily always think that through. We used to talk about, why are you trying to heal through my trauma, as opposed to heal first and then lead. So I always encourage,
yeah,
before we want to take on these grandiose movements, make
right.
sure that you do the internal work first and that you're not bringing stuff into somebody else's life that they now have to deal with.
Yeah. So now, in while this was all going on, when you were taking those huge personal risks and stepping up on a stage and talking about really personal things, at the same time you were training other people to stand up and communicate, right?
Yeah, I don't know if it happened in parallel as much. When I started to
Okay.
really speak up, I wasn't necessarily doing DEI training or anything like that. The
Hmm.
DEI training kind of came because I started speaking. So people started hearing me and they would approach
Right.
me and say, "Oh, have you ever thought of?" And because I had a training background from being at church and all of that, I segued into DEI training. And what's interesting is I never wanted to do DEI training. It's not a space wanted to be in. I really wanted to kind of stay in the LGBTQ plus space. And
Right.
there's that thing, right? Somebody looks at you, and because you're a person of color, they make an immediate assumption. Oh my goodness, you must know something about DEI. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a whole separate conversation around
Right.
monolithic approaches to race. But I ended up getting into DEI because the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion really is not about race. It's about all of the things. It's about all of our identities. It's about all the things that make up our identities. And
Yeah.
it's for all of us. And
Hmm.
anybody, no matter what race, socioeconomic status, gender, orientation, sexuality, all can relate to the fact that our identities make up who we are. And if we are not comfortable with our identity, we cannot be comfortable with something that's different from us. So it's back to that
Right.
same thing of DEI for me around diversity is about inclusion. It's about the ability to include people who are different from you, um, who think differently, of different cultures, etc. So when I do DEI work, it's not necessarily the typical race conversation that I'm having, it's the belonging and inclusion conversation,
Oh, okay.
right? It's about
Yeah.
how do you make people belong, regardless, how do you help people feel belonging, regardless of who they are and how they show up.
And it's fascinating to me because it's back to that life path of yours again, where it's about finding comfort in yourself, teaching others to find comfort in themselves so that they can
Provide comfort to
better
other
the
people.
community around
Yeah,
them. Yeah.
exactly.
Wow. That's
And I could
pretty
never plan
fascinating.
this. I did not sit back when I was
Yeah.
16 and say this is what I wanted out of life, right? It's just the way that
Yeah.
it's happened. And a lot of it is because of the 3 years between 2016 and 19 where it was just so hard to love
Right.
myself. But when I saw the reward of it on the other end, I was like, we all we all got to do this. This is worth
Yeah.
it's worth the pain to accept who you are, regardless of what
Yeah.
anybody else thinks of it.
So now if you were, starting the angel school of presenting now, what life lessons from the things, the experiences that you've gone through would you share with that class to help them become better presenters?
Um, I think the first one would be learn to separate the voice of other people from your own. One of the
Oh,
things I
nice.
think people are afraid of when they speak is what other people will think of them, or if I make a
Mm,
mistake, or if I say something stupid. And we have got to learn that we are our greatest cheerleader. We have to be our greatest cheerleader, right?
right.
And so that would be the first thing I would talk about is learning to own your own voice. As part of that, become really familiar and comfortable with your story. Every angle of your story, the ins and out. Learn how to tell your story positively. Learn how to tell your story and share the parts that get really icky sometimes. Learn how to tell your story from a place for a child to get something out of it, learn how to tell it in a corporate sense, and learn how to tell it in a nonprofit sense. And all of those ways of telling your story are different. But coming to a place where you know yourself and your story so well that you can tell it to the audience that's in front of you and they will get something from it. And I think that was the most work I had to do because I knew my story. And there were times that I helped other survivors write their story, and they would traumatize themselves. They would traumatize the audience because they were sharing maybe a little too much detail or it had gotten too graphic.
Right.
And starting to realize that just sharing your story is not, that's not it. It's now
Right.
learning how to share your story in a way that people are not shocked, right? They're not entertained by your trauma, but they're changed, and that compassion comes out, and they're moved to action. So yeah, that's kind of how I would do that. I don't know how many steps or lessons that was, but that's what I would do.
No, and what I'm really want to highlight in what you said is that knowing your personal story and being accepting of it
Hmm.
can help you become a stronger person.
Right.
But to be a really good speaker is not just about sitting in that particular story. It's also becoming savvy about, okay, is this an opportunity for me to share my story? Or is the parallel of, I'll just take this example of Angel feeling alone in that apartment as a little girl, is that experience, that connection to that emotion somehow apply to someone who, I don't know, is developing X, Y, and Z software and the frustration they're feeling that others don't understand it. Now you have a bridge when you're creating a speech or a presentation where you can sit in that emotion and say, from my personal experience, I know that sense of isolation. So let me talk about that. I don't have to talk about Angel in the
Exactly.
apartment. I don't have to talk about,
Yeah.
but I think it really transforms when you start to think about putting together a presentation as more than a series of slides. It's connecting the pieces to your emotional truths. Um, it helps you come into the room with a different persona, a different sense of comfort,
Yeah.
wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think
Yeah,
people pick up on the genuineness, right? Like you said, you don't have to share the actual experience, but if you can sit in the emotion of the experience, that energy is what they sense in the room, and that's what they connect with. And now
right,
you're not just an entertainer who is reading a speech off of a piece of paper. You're somebody who
right,
cares and is willing to, I think it's Brene Brown that talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy, and that ability to get down in the pit with them because you understand what it's like to be in the pit and hold their
right.
hand and take them out of the pit.
Yep,
Um,
yep.
and that's why I love
And
speaking.
yeah, agreed, agreed. And do you think the being humble is important? Talk to me a little bit about being
I
humble
think
and
we have to
humility.
first define humility because I think
Okay,
humility is misdefined, misinterpreted as
right.
being small and pretending that you're less than. And oh no, that's not me. I couldn't do that. I'm not good enough. That is not humility. I think humility is on the flip side owning all of who you are, how amazing
Mm,
you are,
right.
how fantastic you are, how great and bright you are, and walking in that truth and saying, I am all this, and so are you. And that's what humility means to me is having the courage to own that we're all here for a reason. We all have purpose, we all have passion, we all have dreams, we all have something to offer each other, and the humility comes in accepting that. I think we have misunderstood humility, and it's false humility to say that I'm less than. It takes much more
Yes.
courage to say that I'm something because now that I say I'm great, now what am I going to do with it?
Yeah.
And that takes a whole lot more courage. And I think it takes humility to admit that you're something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's why I
now that we
always love the
define
expression.
right. So now that we define humility as that, that's
Yep.
what drives a good story because now you're coming from a place of truth and you're coming from a place of confidence. You're not coming from a place of fear. You're not coming from a place of self doubt because people in the audience pick up on that. You don't have to say it, they feel it, just like we talked about, that emotion. And so if you can tell
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
from a place of you truly believing your story, that's where it's
Well
at.
said. I'm so glad people are listening to this. I want them all to hear these little tidbits that you're giving me. And another little tidbit before I let you go today, I really want you to talk about is something that I've been thinking about ever since we had one of our first conversations. You said that I don't want to paraphrase it here and butcher it, but you were talking to me about how being vulnerable, you also have to at the same time know how to protect yourself, especially
Mm,
in a Q and A. Tell me a little bit about that and how you work with people to understand that balance.
yeah. So I always say Q&As are like, it feels like the most dangerous place to go. And, one of the things as a volunteer for Elephant in the Room, one of the things that they do is train how to facilitate difficult conversations. And they do it using applied theater. And the ability to, let's just say first, the ability is to be able to hear that people disagree with you and not take it necessarily personally, right? So I've
Right.
been in
Yep.
Q&As where, how do you really know you're gay? What's the science behind it? Don't you think you're going to hell? And being able to sit in those places and not take offense and not allow it to
Mhm.
beat you up. But for me, it comes back to I need to own my truth and what I believe about myself. And that's what I use to protect me and ground me. Having said that, one of my greatest fears is being in a place where that conversation can get really out of hand and
Yeah.
um, your identity is what's being attacked, right? So it's
Yeah.
one thing having a Q&A about a topic about how this product works or something like that.
Right.
It's another thing when and maybe it's even different when you're thinking about DEI and diversity. And it's such a polarizing conversation right now because it's being so politicized
Oh
around,
my God. And so much fear out there
right, exactly.
of the possibility. Yeah.
So that might be even a type of Q&A. But when you're talking about Q&A around sexuality and identity, it becomes that you're talking about me. And so
Right.
one of the hardest Q&As for me to facilitate is ones that challenge my existence. Because I'm like, I'm standing
Mm.
right in front of you and you're saying I
Yeah.
don't exist or that what I think about myself is unreal or something like that, right? And
Right.
so I bound Q&As upfront. I am very clear with this is where we can go and this is where we don't go. This is what I believe. If you have a question about me personally, take it out offline and we can have a one-on-one around it. But let's keep questions and answers civil and continue to show respect for each other. And really think about the phrase trust, intent, and acknowledge impact. I want to believe that everybody has the intention of being good when they're asking a
Yeah.
question. The reality is words have impact, and there's sometimes questions really can impact the speaker, and we have to be willing to acknowledge the impact of our words and put that above the intention of our question. And so a lot of times in my trainings I start with ground rules around how we are going to learn, how we're going to communicate, and how we're going to sit in even a place of cultural humility where even the words that you use might be different to the words that I use, and they may have different meanings for us as humans. And we have to learn to acknowledge and apologize at times. We've been in places where I've had to apologize to somebody because I've used a word that might be offensive to them. And vice
Right.
versa. But I'm a huge fan of setting ground rules, norms for learning upfront. So the Q&As are usually framed within that.
Yeah. I love that idea that a way to protect yourself when you're speaking, and even if it's not a super personal, vulnerable moment, set the ground
Mhm.
rules. We're going to do a Q&A thing today, but I want to stick to these
Yes.
topics. I want to stick to that is your right as a
100%.
person, as a human. Yeah.
100%. Absolutely.
And talk to me about the power of the pause in those situations. Do you find pausing to collect your response is valuable in
Yes,
those kind of moments?
I do. And ironically, a lot of people don't like silence. Silence makes other people uncomfortable. And sometimes if you
Right.
pause just long enough, they're like, oh, don't worry about it. I don't need you to answer that question. um, but
Moving on.
I use the pause to collect and to make sure that I'm pitching my answer at the right level. I
Mhm.
also use a self reflection. So, this is what I'm hearing you say. Is this your question? And while I'm doing that, I use that as an opportunity to really begin to understand maybe how I would want to answer it. Um, and sometimes they've reframed the question when you repeat it back to them. And that also brings some clarity and can maybe narrow down the answer for you. So pause and self reflection back to the speaker or the person asking is really effective. And learn to slow down. And you know what? There are going to be times when you don't want to answer the question, and it's okay to
Right.
say that. And there's going to be times when you don't have an answer to the question, and it's okay to say that. And we have to be okay with saying, I don't know.
Ah,
We can say, I
I want to
don't
scream that from the
know.
rooftops. That's my biggest thing. I mean, don't pretend.
Right.
If you don't have the answer, people will respect you much more
Yeah.
if you say, good question. I don't have the answer to that, but I'll get
But
it,
I'll get it.
or I'll,
Yeah. And
yeah,
I'll follow up with you and let's take the information and I'll follow up with you after. And I've had a lot of really good one on ones after just because of that. People will reach out and
yeah,
say, Thank you for responding to me, because that's one thing you have to make sure. If you say that, please follow up. Send an email, something, and let them know. Even if it's this is the place to go to look for the answer. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's so effective because now they think you care and you see them as a person.
Right.
Right? Really
Right.
powerful.
And I love that part where you said, reword the question.
Hmm.
Sometimes I teach people that in challenging moments when people are challenging, maybe it's right in the middle of a speech or a presentation, they say, how do you know that equals that?
Hmm.
Sometimes I find one of the most powerful ways to buy yourself time is to look around the room and say, okay, I'm hearing you're not agreeing with this, or you're coming from it from this perspective. How many folks in this
Agree.
room
Yeah.
feel that way also?
Yes.
That buys you time, and not only does it buy you time, it's a great way to find allies in a room and not be the sole person bucking this very strong, powerful,
Yeah.
rebuke in the middle of presentation.
Yeah. 100%. That's a great way of handling it, and really trying to say, like, bring them down from saying that to what is the real question that you're asking here,
Oh yeah,
you
good.
know?
Yeah.
And how can we find the answer together, and almost turn it to be this collaborative moment, like you said, involve the audience and let's talk about this together. And now you've lost all of this negative energy from the room, and people are like, oh my gosh, they're willing to talk about it. Let's talk about it.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I love it.
Goes back to everybody wants to be included
Yeah,
and be heard from an authentic place, be their true selves. Give them that opportunity, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Angel, I have loved this conversation. I could talk to you for a million more hours. I do love to wrap up these podcasts by asking two questions. One is, you've come a long way. Now you're this confident speaker and you love getting on podcasts and stuff, but what are you still afraid of?
I touched on it earlier. It's definitely the space of being rejected again. You
Yeah.
know, as much as
And how do you help people, or how do you help yourself get over that fear of rejection?
yeah, as much as I know my truth, etc. Sometimes I have to do a lot of grounding work before and remind myself of why I'm here. And I think all around speaking is, what do you want the people to walk away with? So at some point in time, the audience needs to be more important than you are, right? And
Yeah.
so if my focus is on my audience, then I can remind myself, okay, you get to leave and reground and regroup. But yeah, rejection is definitely my deepest fear. And so, not my deepest fear, one of my biggest fears. And so, what I tell people is, assume that it's going to happen. Go there.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
Right.
Right? Face the
Right.
fear before it actually happens. And then you realize it's one person in hundreds of people that you're surrounded by. It's okay. It's okay. And
Yeah.
everybody's entitled to their opinion, right? And giving that permission to be the thing, and that person has their own lived experience that you are completely unaware of as
Yeah.
well. So being able to give grace and compassion is one of the ways I try and kind of navigate those spaces.
That's wonderful. And my second question is usually, what would you say? What would be your top three one sentence tips for people who are still afraid to speak? And I think you dabbled
Mhm.
it in there, but I'm still going to give you a shot. Give me your top three important things for people to do if they're feeling nervous about speaking.
If you're feeling nervous about speaking, I would encourage you, love yourself first. Usually,
Amen.
what
Love it.
we're afraid of is that somebody won't like us. So, love yourself first, know your story, and accept the good and the bad, because you are amazing and you have something to say and you have something to offer, and we all do.
Wonderful. Wonderfully said. Thank you so much again, Angel. Anything else you want to say before we sign off here?
No, this has been great. Love speaking to you, Mike, and um, thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Let's get out there and help people love themselves.
Awesome. You take
Take care, Angel.